Hi, everyone. Welcome to History Room Live. My name is Jill. I'm the archivist and special collections cataloger, special collections librarian at Patent Free Library. Karen is here too. She is an assistant in the history room, and she's a genealogy expert. Back in April, Karen came up with the idea to offer these weekly Zoom sessions so that we could continue to share the collections and resources of the history room while we're closed. Karen has given presentations on genealogy and storytelling, and I've talked a little bit about our collections, including a current project called How's Your Week Going? We are collecting stories from our patrons about their experiences during COVID-19, which we'll be archiving for the benefit of future historians and future patrons. You can find more information about that project on our website or reach out to me with questions about it. Today I'm really excited because we have a guest presenter, and I'm gonna let Karen introduce our presenter because they've known each other for quite a long time now. And I think Karen also has some information that she wants to share. So take it away, Karen.
Alrighty, thank you. And that was a lovely introduction. And I do want to make sure to say that I kind of pitched the idea, but a lot of credit for this program also has to go to Jill, absolutely, because she helped refine it. And she does a lot of the behind the scenes work as well as on screen, obviously. So yes, a couple things I wanted to mention, because I do check in occasionally with the Ancestry Library Edition, and it has been extended. The remote access for the Library Edition has been extended through the end of June. And I obviously highly recommend that, not just for genealogy, but even just anybody who's interested in history in general. There are a lot of collections in there you could use for a number of things. And the other thing I want to mention is there's a conference, an online virtual free conference coming up from Scottish Indexes. It's a website, and they also have a Facebook page, but it's the Facebook group that you will need to join to take part in that. That will happen June 8th, Monday, June 8th. I can't give you the hours right now, but they usually run it twice. They have multiple presenters. The last time I was able to attend, thankfully, and they offer the schedule in multiple time formats so that you don't have to figure out the time zone because they're in Scotland. So as more information comes out, if you go to the Scottish Indexes Facebook group, join them, and you'll be able to, when they start sharing more, when they have more to share, you'll be able to keep up with that. And I highly recommend it. It was very good. And so now, of course, moving on to our person of the day, Jack. I've been volunteering with him for a couple of years now, and he's a brilliant young man, and he's been working for a very long time on this StoryMap. And I'm going to now pass it to him and he's also, I want to mention too, he's working on his MLS right now with the archival trek. So he's on his way to places. So take it away, Jack.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. As Karen said, my name's Jack. I have been volunteering at the History Room for, I think, about the past 3 years now, as of this summer, if I've done my math right. Highly possible that I haven't. And then I'm also currently pursuing my MLS at Simmons with a focus in archiving. And beyond volunteering, I've occasionally assisted and subbed in as History Room manager from time to time. But anyway, I think most of you already knew me, so that was wholly unnecessary. But for the few who might not, that's who I am. Today, what I'm going to be talking about is a walking tour of Bath. That's been my pet project for like the past 2 years, 18 months-ish. As Karen said, it has been a very long time in the making. Incremental progress. It actually started as like a small focused project that I was working on as a volunteer in the History Room. I was just sort of transcribing a manuscript that we had, and not a whole lot was going to come of it other than a transcription. But during my undergrad, it actually turned into an extended research project that ultimately produced the walking tour and story map that we're going to be looking at today. So let me start sharing my screen so I can show off the lovely, oh, Jill, my screen sharing is disabled.
I'm sorry, Jack, I'll fix that.
All right, in a second, I'll share my screen with the presentation of, and we can get started.
why that is,
Hmm.
and I have now fixed it. You should be able to go ahead.
All right.
Great.
I think there we go. Everyone can
Yep,
see
I
what we're
can see
looking
it.
at?
Mhm.
Okay. Still everyone can see it now that we're in like play mode?
Yes.
All right. Okay, just making sure before I forge on ahead. So just to give sort of an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today, first I'm going to talk a bit about the origins of the project beyond the little spiel that I just gave, sort of how, because it has an interesting history beyond just my involvement in it. So we'll get to that. And then I wanted to touch on transcription, what it is and why we do it, because I've realized that, well, that's a term that those of us in the history room and the archiving world are familiar with. There are other people who might not know what it is. And even if they do, they certainly don't know quite why we do it. And then after I've gotten through all the boring stuff, we're going to get to the fun part and actually take the tour. And I'm sort of going to talk about what a story map is, how do you use it, and then we're actually going to basically take the tour virtually so that we don't have to go walk out in this dreadful humidity right now. In theory, it was going to be raining today, and this would have been a great thing to do on a rainy day, but instead, we are inside on a sunny day taking it virtually. And then at the end, if there's still some time left, I'm going to talk a bit more about the process of creating this, including the research and how do we go from an original manuscript to a virtual walking tour. And then obviously, as Jill mentioned, at the end, we'll have like a big Q&A session, but I'm going to try and break it down with, you know, pauses to ask questions between each of these sections so that if you want to know something specific and don't want, or are worried that you won't remember it 30 minutes after the fact, there will be times in between to field a few questions here and there. So I guess, sorry, let me find my place in my notes. So right now I just wanted to talk a bit about, before we get into the swing of things, the sheer amount of work that has gone into creating this. And for a minute, I want you to imagine that you are functionally illiterate. And between the ages of 10 to 14, you have spent most of your waking hours pricking yourself stitching clothes and burning yourself ironing pleats, and you are not at all being compensated for this. And that's your life until, you know, roughly your 20s. Despite that upbringing, though, you actually managed to become a highly well-respected historian and sort of a prolific writer. At this point, I'm sure you've realized that I'm not talking about me. I have indeed never worked a horrible apprenticeship in my life. Nor do I think I'm functionally illiterate, though. Other people might disagree. So I'm not talking about me, I am talking about this distinguished-looking gentleman right here, Levi PETERSON Lemont. So Levi Lemont was born in Bath in 1801, and as I started talking about, he spent his youth as an indentured apprentice to a tailor, and then ultimately later on became a tailor. And an indentured apprenticeship wasn't the nice, like, student-teacher relationship that we're probably thinking of. It often meant that you spent your formative years basically performing very menial slave labor because your pay was in you had a place to stay and occasionally got new clothes. It wasn't quite the mentor protege type thing that we might envision. That happened after you had spent about 7 years as an apprentice. Then you would have become a journeyman. And then after spending further years as a journeyman working under a master, you might finally have become a master tailor yourself and potentially opened your own workshop. But so very little opportunity in that for a formal education beyond what you would need to potentially run your own store someday. You didn't really need to read the classics or perform very complicated math beyond the basic addition of charging people things. And yet Levi Lemont actually self-educates himself and teaches himself how to read and write, and goes on to actually become a very well-known writer. And I say well-known in the context of Bath. And we actually still refer to quite a few of his works today, especially when we go and look at the 19th and 18th centuries of Bath's history. He's still, although there are a few, you know, interesting moments here and there where he needs to be fact-checked, but generally 100, 200 years later, he's still a highly credible source of information. And so it was in 1879, he starts compiling notes on what he called an historic walking tour of Bath, which is what you should see on your screen now to the left. It's a photocopy of his original handwritten notes, and he was going to turn these into a proper walking tour at the time, though unfortunately he dies before he ever gets time to really finish it and publish it. And then what you should see at the right is the transcription of those that I created and what sort of started this whole process. Is that was the initial project was just taking these notes and transcribing them before it ever blossomed into something much larger than that. Da, 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 da. Oh gosh. Unfortunately, in the 19th century, their spelling was a bit of a recommendation, and his handwriting wasn't the clearest, as you can tell. But especially the spelling, it was he gets creative with quite a few words that it takes some time to puzzle out. And actually, when we talk a bit more about transcription, I hopefully have a fun activity that we'll see if people want to try their hands at like basic transcribing. We'll talk more about that when we get there. That's sort of it that I wanted to talk about Lemont himself. I don't imagine there are any real questions about him, but if anyone has any, just throw them in the chat. Jill can let me know. I'll pause for like 10 seconds. You know, maybe someone can hum the Jeopardy music to themselves as we wait here. All right, that's probably, I don't think there's that much to really ask about that, but I just wanted to make sure that if anything was unclear or confusing, you had time to ask that now. So we'll move on to the process of transcription itself. And what exactly is transcription? We talk about it. Basically, when we transcribe something, it's an archival practice where we take an original document or manuscript and then we rewrite it to improve its usability. It used to be much more about handwriting them and just making the handwriting clearer, but now as we live in a digital age, this means that most of them are now typed and they become digital copies of the original document, which makes them easier to read, first of all, because as we all know, and many of us probably lament, most people do not learn cursive anymore and therefore struggle to read handwriting. But beyond that, it also makes them easier to go through quickly. So for a researcher, even one who, you know, is capable of reading cursive, it is much faster to go through something that has been typed up than trying to decode the words that can sometimes take you several hours to puzzle out what on earth this phrase is supposed to be. And then it also, it improves accessibility for people with disabilities because you can use a screen reader with a digital copy of something, and you can't really do that with the original handwritten notes. So it's all part of archiving's attempts to try and reach as many of our users as possible and make sure that all of the collection materials are as readily available and easy to use and not complicated or confusing or exclusionary. So that's just what transcription is. And then, so for a little fun activity, here we have an interesting note from Levi Lemont's notes that he had. And I just wanted to see if anyone had any guesses as to what the word highlighted in blue is. Actually,
Atrium?
No, good guess.
Not atrium.
Nope.
Avian?
Nope.
There was a steamer union.
That's almost it. That's actually how we did find out what this was, but it's not the Union. All right, I'll stop you now. It is ocean, spelled O-T-I-A-N. You know, everyone's favorite way of spelling that word. And it took us a significant amount of time to puzzle out what that was. So mind you, if you did not grasp that in about the 20 seconds or so that I gave you, don't feel bad. It took us in the history room a solid day of running back and forth, going, what do you think this is? Could that be a T, or are we looking at like some very strange D? And then finally, we went to the newspapers and saw, okay, well, was there a steamship? It turns out there was one called the Ocean. And then if you read it phonetically, it makes a bit of sense that, okay, you can get ocean out of that. So that's just a bit about how transcription works, the process, the point that it's not easy, but why we do it and why it's important and helpful, because, you know, even for those of us who can read our cursive and were taught well in elementary school, obviously that word's not very easy to read. Oops, I'm actually going. So now what we're going to do is back out of this and we are going to start the tour itself. Now we get to do the fun things. All right, so right now you should be able to access the link on the library website, I believe. Correct, Jill? Yes, it's up there because that's how I found it.
Yes, and I'm going to paste it into the chat right now.
All right.
But you go ahead and it'll be up in just a moment.
All right. So no need to follow along with, but Jill will have the link for you so that you can go to this, and it is on the library website. But when you open the story map, this is the very first window that you will see in the desktop view. And so basically what we are looking at here is this is the walking tour. As you can see over to the left-hand side, we have our map with our points on it, as you would expect to find on a paper version of a map like this. And then onto the right, we have this little window that tells you, it's just the introduction to this. A lot of it's what I've already covered. It's a brief history of Bath that I wrote up for, people who might not be quite as familiar with the area, explaining a little bit about our history. I'm not going to get into that because, again, I've covered most of it. It's not super thrilling, and I'm sure most people here already have a fairly sound idea that Bath, shipbuilding town, been around for quite a while, all the fun stuff. And at the bottom, you can see sort of some of the first few points on the map itself going in order. And so this is the desktop view, but StoryMaps is also mobile compatible, and so we can have a phone view that people can pull up on their smartphones. And that will look something more like this, which is a bit more intimidating because not everything's on the screen at once. But here it has the introduction would be, what your first screen is going to load. And then you can go to the map tab up at the top, and that will open the map for you. And you'll see like the first point down below. And then you can access the full list itself on the list side of things. I just wanted to sort of show this off so that everyone saw that it is indeed mobile compatible. You can go walk around with your smartphone and take this tour. But for our purposes today, I'm going to mostly be using the desktop view just because I think it's a bit clearer and easier for everyone to see what we're looking at. So what StoryMaps actually is it's a basically browser-based software that allows you to create an interactive map that can be used to tell stories or cover historical topics, I've done here, and it requires no coding experience. I will basically say that most of this, you just sort of plug in your own images. They have maps that you can access. It's done by a company called ArcGIS in collaboration with Esri. Not really that important to know, but if you wanted to look it up and make your own, it is free to use and very easy to use because you don't need to know what you're doing, because I certainly don't know what I'm doing when it comes to computers, and I could figure it out. But without further ado, let's actually move on to the tour itself, which would start you at the Visitor Information Center down in Bath on Vine Street. It's a little brick building, looks like a train station because it actually was a train station. The current structure was built in 1941, and the reviews at the times raved about the surprisingly comfortable green chairs. That was noted in our little paper when it was first built, that the chairs were surprisingly comfortable. It was the train station for the Main Central Railroad back when Bath was still serviced by the trains regularly, and we had a much more robust public transit system in general in this country. And it served in that capacity until 1959, when the rail service from the Main Central Railroad effectively ended. And at which point it became a dental clinic until the 1990s, mostly serving employees of BIW and their dental plan, which is bizarre to think that it actually spent significantly more time as a dental clinic than a train station. And then in the early 2000s, it became the Visitor Information Center and the headquarters for Main Street Bath, which is our local sort of downtown organization that coordinates most of our events and all that fun stuff. And here I have also included the key about what the various colors on the map mean. Blue structures are still standing. Red structures no longer exist. Green structures are commercial properties, of which there are very few. As I was choosing locations on this for the tour, there were some things that had to be cut simply for time as I was making it, and I'd love to go back and add them later, like some of our downtown businesses that survive, upwards of 3 fires. But so green is commercial properties, and then purple is a private residence, and just a little note of if you go and take the tour, please respect people's privacy and understand that these are homes that people still live in and thereby don't go traipsing through their garden. It's not like they're house museums, and they haven't necessarily agreed to be featured in a tour. But if you just walk along the sidewalk and read a bit about their house, I don't think anyone will object to that. Also, most people in Bath are very friendly, so no need to worry. But that's it for the for the train station. And then we would walk under the viaduct, which is, not currently a very interesting view, but actually at one time there's a very interesting building there. It was where Governor King's house was after it was moved. We'll get to where it was first, next, but basically it was moved onto Vine Street directly under where the viaduct now is. They did indeed bulldoze the first governor of Maine's house to put in a viaduct at one point, unfortunately. But as you can see from the image that we have here, it actually spent some time as a hotel. After William King had died, and he no longer lived in his house, it was also known to be quite fancy at the time with lovely French plate mirrors. It became first the king, oh, let's see. Let me not get this wrong, especially because it's written here, and that means all of you can correct me. It becomes the Shannon House eventually when Jerry Shannon purchases it and turns it into a tavern where people could stay after it's moved onto Vine Street, and then eventually becomes the King Tavern, and then is bulldozed unceremoniously. And they discovered at the time that they think, at the time of destruction, that they believe the original structure was only about 1.5 stories tall, and yet, as you can see, by that time we had reached about 4 stories tall, not including the basement. So it had significant additions, and really by the time it was on its way out, it was no longer the original house anymore. So we can feel a bit better about it being gone, but still, we had his house and we no longer have it. So very sad. The place that it originally sat was on what is now the Custom House. If we continued along Commercial Street there, we would come and see the back end of the Custom House, and it is custom, no S on the end. It took me a long time to get used to that, but properly, for some reason, Bath's Customs House is the Custom House. And that was constructed in the 1870s, and because originally we had a very important port at various points in our history, but it sort of bounced around in locations. I'm very nervous talking about all the shipbuilding things because I know Nathan is here and he certainly knows more than me on the topic, but I'm still gonna try and get through this. It was built in the 1870s as where we put the custom office and also housed the post office for an extended period of time, which is another building that hopped around downtown very frequently until it finally lived here before it outgrew it and went somewhere else, tragically. And interesting to note, if you've ever seen the Custom House, which I assume most of you have, but even for those who don't, in this image you can see on the side it has 3 windows, and now it has, I don't know if it's 4 or 5. Anyway, at one point they extended it by taking off the entire back of this building, adding in a middle section to make it bigger, and then putting the back of the building back on, which meant that they managed to expand it almost seamlessly and without really ruining the aesthetics of a very lovely structure. And and this is where William King's yard originally was, basically. It went west towards Front Street. It basically sat right where the Custom House is, not quite right there, but it would have been his lovely gardens at one point. And there's still a little cute parkland around the Custom House, maybe not quite so lovely as it would have been at the time, but c'est la vie. As we forge on, continuing down Commercial Street, we end up at the foot of Broad Street, which at one point was one of the most significant landings in Bath. It was called the City Landing. No longer there, unfortunately, although you can still see some of the, let me close this again. If you look here and see sort of these like almost stair-like things that sort of keep track of the water level and helped with, getting onto your boat a bit, those, I believe there are a few of them still there. Obviously, I need to go walk along the waterfront more if I don't, but the problem with working in the history room, you start getting confused about what's presently there and what you've just seen very nice photos of. But the City Landing was important. It's where most of the ferries that went to like Booth Bay Harbor and that would have docked in Bath when we had ferry services regularly. Also, another thing of the past, like the train service, unfortunately. And it remained in operation from 1836 when it was built until the late 1950s, 56 or 57. We couldn't quite puzzle out exactly when the City Landing stopped functioning, but so it had basically a 120-year run in which it was one of the most significant landings in the city of Bath. And then if we move on to, so this is sort of the most confusing turn of this map. You would have to then go up Broad Street. You would take a little jog on Front Street, go down Center Street to Water Street, and then turn right. But I know that that's sort of out of the way, but I couldn't exclude where the original iron foundry that becomes Bath Iron Works was. And it becomes Bath Iron Works in a very roundabout way. And I'm going to consult my notes for this because it's confusing history, to say the least. It started in 1833 by the Moses brothers, who moved their foundry that they had on Vine Street here to this location on the east side of Water Street. And in 1851, it's purchased by C.A. Lambert, who eventually in 1864 sells it to Edward Warden, who renamed it to the Bath Iron Foundry. And Warden is the cousin of General Thomas Hyde, who was a Civil War general, and after the war ends, he comes back to Bath and then begins taking on the task of running the iron foundry, buying it from his cousin for, I believe, $17,000. Then in 1884 is when it becomes Bath Iron Works, because General Thomas Hyde sort of starts expanding the business and also incorporates Hyde Windlass Company around the same time, and purchases Goss Marine Works, which is where the current Bath Iron Works basically starts from. So that is the one that's, you know, the great big place that we think of as Bath Iron Works with the lovely big cranes that sits on the river on the east side of Washington Street. And so that eventually is obviously the location that takes off because of where BIW is now, as opposed to the little one on Water Street that continues producing some things for a while, but by 1904, it has basically been abandoned and is referred to as dilapidated. But that is still where Bath Iron Works started in a very strange way. The little foundry that eventually becomes a very large shipyard that not all in the same place. So then we will continue down Water Street, take a right on Elm Street, take a left back onto Front Street before turning up Summer Street and see what is probably to most of us a very recognizable building, the Patent Free Library. Yay, everyone's favorite, certainly my favorite library. It was started in the 1850s by the Patent brothers as basically a reading association at the time when libraries weren't quite what we thought of them as being. Most often, wealthy people would partake in libraries, and for a fee, then you could borrow books from a collection. It wasn't a public utility of any sense. It was, but also this sort of, at the time, your educated pocket had the money to participate in that way anyway. But the Patent Free Library eventually becomes a free library in the 1880s, I believe, or actually 1879, they get a location on Center Street, and then because they decided that they needed the building as their collections were growing, and then in 1889, they build a brand new building where it is now, which is the old part of the library, and part of the conditional donation of Galen Moses, who contributed $10,000, and then some when construction inevitably ran over budget. He said that it needed to be free and open to the entire public, so that it wasn't going to be this exclusive sort of thing that only the wealthy and educated could use. It was meant to be a public library as we understand them, and that is why it is the patent-free library, to differentiate it from the libraries at the time that were not free, even though we now mostly can't really conceive of a private library in the sense that they knew them then. And amongst the very interesting things that we have in the history room, there is a book plate from the original association. I think that's somewhere in the special collections in the boardroom. So if you ever, once things reopen again, I highly recommend going and checking that out. It is so neat to see this old book plate that survived over, gosh, 150 something years at this point. Definitely worth looking at. And that's the Patent Free Library. It had to be on here. It's near and dear to my heart, probably to all of our hearts. And you can still go walk around the old part of the building, which is now our fiction stacks and the reading room. The other location, if we continue up Summer Street, so there's, unfortunately, we in the history room do not have a good photo of this. At some point, I'm going to ask the Maritime Museum if they would consent to allow us to use their lovely image that they have of the carriage factory when it was there. But on Summer Street, there was a little carriage factory, as you can see here, owned by Edward Gove. And this was one of Bath's stranger businesses. That's why it's on here. Originally, it was the Unitarian Meeting House before the Unitarian Society disbands in the 1860s. And then it gets sold to the city of Bath to become an armory, who immediately resell it and apparently never really use it as an armory to Edward Gove, who turns it into a place to manufacture carriages, which continues in Bath's tradition of sort of unique businesses in line with the Bath Box Factory and the Stinson Sardine Cannery. We've had a variety of very strange little niche businesses that I think it's fun to include and point out are odd moments of industry that we don't quite think of, because we think of Bath shipbuilding, our cute little downtown, but not many other things, and yet we had a variety of businesses in that at various points throughout our history. And so now we would continue all the way up Summer Street, take a right onto Washington and walk down all the way past the park until we get to 945 Washington Street. But for a moment, we're actually going to pivot back to a presentation, and I'm going to give a little primer on architecture. It's not going to be terribly detailed because I believe the hope is to give at some point another topic for one of these sessions would be architecture more broadly. And so, oh, connection is unstable. Hopefully everyone can still hear me okay. Yes? I'll assume so. So just a little primer on architecture. At some point, we're going to, okay, just making sure. Yeah. At some point, it'll be a more detailed one, so I'm not going to get too much into it, just enough to sort of discuss some of Bath's most prominent building styles. So let me switch back over to my presentation, and we are going to start with probably Bath's most prominent building style, which is Greek Revival. And Greek Revival is a classical revival style, which is what prevailed in Europe and therefore in America for, oh, several centuries. Some form of classical revival was the prevailing architectural style, and mainly the Greek Revival looked to Greek temple fronts in terms of determining how they wanted to structure their houses and what they wanted to evoke. It was popular in the 1820s to the 1850s. It was so popular in the United States, actually, that it was at one point called the national style, because basically almost every house was going, not every house, but one of the most prevalent styles was Greek Revival all around the country. And it is distinguished by its columns in the front usually, and its complete pediments. And if you don't know what a pediment is, it's the little triangle-y bit that you can see there on top. If you think, there, I have highlighted it. And sometimes you can very easily distinguish a Greek Revival because it looks a bit like a child's drawing of a house, where it has this little square bottom and then a separate triangle that goes on top with its closed off bottom. That is one way to pick out a Greek Revival most of the time. Of course, there are always exceptions to things. Some of them do not have complete pediments, but if you see something with a full pediment and with columns in the front, there's like a 90% chance that it's probably going to be a Greek Revival, and in Bath, almost certainly. So why was the Greek Revival style so popular? Well, one of the reasons was that from 1821 to 1830, there was the Greek War of Independence. I'm not going to get too much into this. Suffice to say, Greece is seeking its independence from the Ottoman Empire, and the United States feels a certain kinship with basically every country that is trying to divorce itself from some parent empire at the time, particularly the Greeks, which is still seen as the birthplace of democracy. And so part of that sympathy turns into really popularizing Greek architecture and culture, and that's what leads to the Greek Revival style becoming so big in the United States at the time. Also, Lord Byron fought in it. Fun fact, if you didn't know that. The dandy poet of Great Britain went and fought in a war and actually died in it, unfortunately. So he's now a Greek national hero. Little history lesson there aside, I just wanted to point out here so you can see the side-by-side of the original Greek temples and what a Greek Revival house looks like. This is not a house in Bath, by the way. I just thought it was a nice head-on that really sort of gets the evocation of the Greek temple front and how these houses looked an awful lot like them, what they were going for. So the second popular style in Bath, and it's what most houses are, if they are not a Greek Revival, there's a good chance they're an Italianate, which is part of the picturesque movement, which was a reaction against formal classicism that started in the UK. It was the idea that sort of the Greek Revivals and most of the structure or styles that had come before them were just a bit overly formal and stuffy in a way, which of course, you know, is funny because now we see these houses and go, ah, yes, how much less formal those truly are. But the idea was that they evoked the rambling Italian farmhouses that were a bit simpler and more rustic and picturesque. It wasn't meant to be a grand statement. It was meant to be your own personal little Italian villa. And this style prevailed from the 1850s to the 1880s. And so you see an awful lot of them in the Midwest where cities were being built up at the time, but you also see them here in the Northeast as cities hit their economic booms. When people had the money to build new houses, and Italianate was a very popular style. They can often be noted for their low-pitched roofs, their arched windows that come in pairs, and brackets. And when we look at the house on Washington Street, you'll be able to pick out most of those features on it. One of the things that popularized Italianate styles was Queen Victoria's little summer home on the Isle of Wight Osborne House. You know, so now you can see where it becomes an Italian villa, and how this led to the popularization of the style on obviously a much less grand scale. You can also here see our paired arched windows, our low-pitched roofs on the top, and if you look especially on the tower, you can see where the brackets are that are holding up the overhanging eaves. And the final house that shows up a fair bit in Bath, it never becomes as popular in Bath or the United States generally as the other two, is the Gothic revival style. It is also part of the picturesque movement, and you could sort of describe a lot of Gothic revival as Victorian medieval fantasy. It's what the Victorians thought the medieval period was like, and so if you have grand country houses in the UK, you get a lot of those fake castles with their fanciful towers and parapets and all these various romantic adornments. That's where the picturesque comes in. They're meant to evoke castles and cathedrals without being quite as, structurally they don't make as much sense, but they're very pretty to look at. And that was popular from the 1840s to the 1870s and was considered to be more of a rural style. So what that means is that people thought that they looked nice in these green, verdant settings. Out of town, you don't see a lot of buildings in cities or townhouses that were done in Gothic revival, but you see houses that were freestanding and often in the country, or in Bath, where our lovely in-town houses still have nice yards to them and lovely overgrowing trees. And they were especially notable for their steep gables, wide porches. They had those pointed arches that you think of as being on Gothic cathedrals, as you can see in the image here, and verge board, which we'll talk about in 1 second. I would just like to point out that the cathedral here is Gothic. This is what it was based off of, were these highly decorative medieval religious buildings that people sort of turned into a style, what was always meant to be sort of a very public, showy thing, and turning it into a more private home style. And there was also a move towards nature, which is represented in our verge board, also known as the gingerbready bit. That is called verge board, and it usually goes on the inside of eaves, and it will often have sort of organic shapes to it, so that when you cast shadows during the day, it looks like plants or leaves, and there's this evocation of nature and the natural world, and that's also part of that reaction against classicism, which was so stark and white and plain. It was meant to be a bit more flowery and natural feeling. And then, of course, you also will notice here that the little clovery-looking bits are called trifoils, which you probably have seen in some Catholic churches. So that's part of where we get our medieval influences coming in, but used in a different way. It's not quite a religious Holy Trinity anymore. It's more of, oh, isn't that a pretty thing? And I saw that in a church once, so I'll put that on my verge board. A bit more serious than that, but. So now that I have covered these three basic styles, we can return to our walking tour with Bath's lovely example of an Italianate on 945 Washington Street. It's one of my favorite houses in town and has its distinctive olive green trim to it. It's a bit difficult to see in this image, but you can see on its cupola, it has arched windows, and up supporting those eaves are quite a few brackets. Those are defining characteristics of the Italianate. This particular house was built by Captain William Drummond, I believe just before or right around 1851. So it actually would have been one of the first, he would have been on the cutting edge with his Italianate in the early 1850s there. It would have been a very fashionable house in its day, and I think it is still a very fashionable house now. By the 20th century, it was owned by a woman named Mildred Wright, and when she died, she donated it and all of its furnishings to the library in the hopes that it could become a house museum. Unfortunately, it was just true that there was no way to support, there wasn't enough funding to actually support having a house museum. So what the will then specified is that the library sold the house, auctioned off the furnishings, and the proceeds supported the library in that way. But unfortunately, we don't have our lovely house museum that we could have had, and everyone's very sad about that. Still, it's absolutely worth checking out as you walk down Washington Street. I think it's a very handsome little house. I'm also going to speed up a bit because I think I was worried about not talking enough. I should have known myself better. So we're going to go through these next ones. I'll be a bit quicker. The next one is also on Washington Street, and it is one of our lovely Gothic revivals. This is a cute little yellow house. It's very pretty. It sits there. It was built by Dr. John G. Richardson. Unfortunately, he only lived there for a year or two. I don't think much longer before financial difficulties forced him to move out into a slightly more modest home. So there's the sad history of his lovely house that he built. a beautiful little Gothic revival that he didn't get to enjoy much, although at one point he was our mayor and was known as a philanthropist and great participant in Bath's festivities. 972 on Washington Street is a style that I haven't really talked about. It's the federal style. There are a few examples in Bath, but not many of them. This would more come up in an architecture thing, so I'm just going to glance over this. Also, this house has some later embellishments. Those dormers that you can see with the lovely Palladian windows, which are those ones that have like 2 windows and then an arch over them, that is a Palladian window, were added later. It also has a lovely front door that was added later. So it's not a perfect example of an original federal style, and so I'm not going to talk about it much, but it's on the tour, and if you ever take the tour, you can read a bit more about federal styles there. So now we have gotten to Washington Street, we have turned left and gone up North Street, and we have run into what would have been on the corner of North and Middle Streets. There was what was once the North Street Academy, which is one of the early primary schools in Bath that was there for a fair amount of time before being bought by the city in 1830. And then, before that, it was a private schoolhouse, of which we had many of these. I've done another project that was on schoolhouses in Bath. It gets very confusing because you have some that essentially are what we would consider a public school, but they're privately funded and the staffing isn't handled by the city. But this school in 1830 is bought by the city and becomes a true public school, serving in that capacity until the 1850s when they move it over to, I think they move it to Chestnut Street. It might have been Academy Street. It's Chestnut Street. I see it there in the notes. They move it to Chestnut Street. It becomes a residence. Unfortunately, I'm fairly certain that it was torn down at some point. And then they build a new primary school there, which continued to serve the community for several decades after that. Next, so we would continue up North Street and take a left onto High Street now, and then continuing down High Street when we have almost hit Winter Street. That would have been where the old ladies' home was, which was originally sort of willed into being in, it's one of the Ledyards. It's Mary J. Ledyard's will. She leaves a section in her will to create a home for indigent old ladies, which is a sort of mean term, but I guess it's one of the nicer ways you could express it. It was meant to help take care of Bath's aging population, especially old widows or women who did not have children to take care of them, so that there was some recourse for them in old age and they didn't have to live by themselves or support themselves, especially at a time when it was already hard enough for women to work, and certainly if you were an older woman, you shouldn't be working in most of the jobs available. The old ladies' home was created, and by the board's approval, you would pay your small fee, forfeit any property you might have, but most of them didn't at the time. That's why they needed to move to the old ladies' home, and then basically you lived out your days there in the care of the city, more or less. There was a fire at one point in, I believe, the early 1900s. Fortunately, all 10 old ladies who were there at the time survive, and they rebuild it fairly quickly, and they get to go right back living there. The History Room also has a fascinating collection of the applications for the old ladies' home that I would highly recommend checking out. It is fascinating to see some of the things that turn up in these, because it's also a great record of a population that's often a bit invisible. These older ladies who aren't property holders, there are very few of what we typically think of as good sources of records that cover them and what happens to them. So it's nice to go look through the old ladies' home collection and see a bit about one of the more invisible portions of the population. Next on High Street, we have a building that everyone's really very familiar with. It is Morse High School. The image here is the original Morse High School that was built in, I should know this off the top of my head. I want to say it was built in 1904 at the bequest of Charles Wyman Morse. He donates money for there to be a high school in Bath, or a bigger high school. Where the fire station now is, there was Bath High School. Then Morse comes along and is bigger and nicer, and so we have Morse High School. Not named for Charles Wyman Morse, it is named for his mother. Probably a good thing, because Charles Wyman Morse is eventually accused of war profiteering, various banking violations, a whole host of terrible, terrible things that you might not want to name a school after, but it's named after his mother, so no worries there. And technically, he was never found guilty of war profiteering. He was only accused of it, so that makes that better, doesn't it? Maybe. But that structure, unfortunately, with its lovely roof, which I will collapse this again As you can see, it burns down in the late 1920s, 1928 specifically, and then is rebuilt in 1929, and that's the current building that we have, or at least the old brick part, which is then added on to through the various decades, and of course now we are building a brand new high school entirely, and the exact fate of what will become of the current Morse High School, I think, is still up in the air. Hopefully it will be something that preserves at least the older part of the building. That remains to be seen. This is the original one that was there. I think it was much nicer. I wish they'd put the roof on the other one, but alas, they did not. Continuing on our trend of schools being on High Street, there was Bath's first publicly funded school at all, which was the Erudition Schoolhouse. It sort of sat on the corner of High and Center Streets. It was Bath's very first school, built in 1794. It could have up to 70 students in it at one time. And when it was finished being built, there was a little sign that was placed over there that said Erudition. For the longest time, we sort of thought that that was supposed to be the name. As it turned out, when we were going through the school superintending committee's meeting minutes from the 19th century, they never referred to it as the Erudition Schoolhouse. So it was more likely just sort of meant to be an encouraging or an aspirational ideal to the youths passing under that door. And it is now in the history room, and you can go see our cute little sign that is, I believe, over the boardroom door. It's from 1794 when it was finished. And then there would have been, I think about under sort of the courthouse now was originally the North Meeting House, which was the first formal church built in Bath. Before then, they had obviously had places where religious services were held, but this was the first purpose-built church as we would conceive of a church to be in Bath, and it was also where a number of important town functions would have been held, potentially where they might have voted for statehood in 1820. We still don't quite know which of the meeting houses or where in Bath that vote took place. The North Meeting House is one of the contenders, and at various times, classes were actually taught in its upper floors. So it also served as a schoolhouse, despite not being a school, and it's where Bath's Paul Revere bell was originally hung from before it moved to the Universalist Church, and then to the old City Hall, and then to the new City Hall. And it sort of had an ignominious end to its life when the Winter Street Church was built. They moved out of this church, the city declined, and so a merchant bought it and moved it to his wharf and used it as a storehouse. Not necessarily the nicest end for a church, nor one that you would expect. I feel like it would have been quite interesting to watch this have to be moved and become a storehouse, but that's what becomes of it. If we sort of sashayed down Center Street a touch, we would come to Raymond Court, which is where Abraham Hammett's rope walk basically once was. And what a rope walk was is where they would go and twine rope. Back when you more or less had to do that by hand with very simple machines. In a shipbuilding city, we needed an awful lot of rope for all of these vessels. And so these rope walks were quite important parts of it. And Abraham Hammett's was one of them that was so long, it basically would have run, I think, the full length of Raymond Court and probably then some, almost to, I'm not entirely sure how far it would have gone. It's hard to tell from this map, which Abraham Hammett drew himself. Interesting that he didn't label his rope walk, so he was modest in that sense. And he was sort of known as a local scholar in his day. I think we've dated the map to, I think we've guessed about 1825. I think it keeps shifting the estimations earlier, later, depending on the shipyards. I think Nathan was one who might have puzzled out that it was 1825-ish. So that's an ish, a hard ish. Just a fun thing I wanted to point out, because I think rope walks are quite interesting, and they're a building we don't conceive of that you once you did this very long building because you had to go twine your rope out because it wasn't done in a factory like it would be now. And then if we kept going, we would eventually come to the South Meeting House, which now seems like a ridiculously short distance to have your two meeting houses be apart. At the time, it made a bit more sense, and the South Meeting House was another one of, basically was almost used very similar to the North Meeting House. It was where they had important meetings, religious services were held. Most importantly, in the 1850s, it was let out to the Bath's Catholic population, which did not have a church at the time, so that they could hold their services here. And in the 1850s, there was a short-lived political group called the Know Nothing Party that were virulently anti-Catholic and felt that they were, you know, a threat to America's Protestant population and thus had to be dealt with quite severely. And so they march on the South Meeting House at one point and they burn it to the ground. And that is why we do not have any, but there are two lovely paintings depicting this in the reading room of the library. sort of a morbid subject to have painted, but it's actually very interesting and sort of an important part of history to, I think, talk about. Also sort of odd to conceive of the time when it was the Catholics that were the dangerous minority in the United States. And the Know Nothing Party actually fairly quickly fades from obscurity. It whips people up into these frenzies, and then nothing really comes of it all that much, other than obviously the destruction of some property and horrible sentiments. But moving on a bit faster still, we come to the Chadbourne Crooker House. It is the oldest gambrel-roofed structure in Bath, and it sits on Liberty Street. We think it was probably modernized in about the 1870s. It would have originally had one central chimney when it was built in the late 18th century. At some point it was updated, and then you had two chimneys off to the sides. And interestingly of note is that in the upstairs closet, I think there's still some of the original paneling from the house when it was built. Then we come to the Military and Naval Orphans Asylum, a wonderful name for an orphanage. It was started, the society started in 1866 to help take care of those who were orphaned by the Civil War. I believe Sarah Sampson, who was the local nurse, was heavily involved in its creation. And then in 1870, it moves to this structure, which was originally the house of Samuel Davis, who was one of Bath's leading merchants at the turn of the 19th century. South Street was originally called Davis Lane because he owned so much property there, and it was basically Bath's first downtown was on South Street. But then I believe Davis was the one who bought so much property and wanted to charge people so much for it that it hadn't really quite been cemented as a downtown yet. And so people said, no, we'll just go buy property somewhere else, and Center Street becomes our downtown. Had history gone a little differently though, Bath's downtown could have been centered on South Street right now. And unfortunately, Davis also goes under in 1807 when the Embargo Act is passed. So he also sort of fades out of Bath's history at that point, despite up until that point having been one of the most prominent citizens and having his lovely manor house. The roof, also not original, that was added in the 1860s when another family lived there, and they had a well-known Maine architect, Francis Fassett, sort of remodel it a bit, and that's when that mansard roof was put on. And it remained the orphan's home, I believe, until the 1990s, so it spent over 120 years as an orphanage. Also, on the opposite corner of South and High Streets was the old gun house. It has been one of those buildings. I added it to this tour simply because it has remained an elusive mystery, because there are very few references to it. Basically, it would have been the gun house during the War of 1812, which was a war that we don't talk about an awful lot, but in Bath, it was particularly impactful because having another war with Britain brought most trade to a screeching halt other than privateering, because suddenly you had British vessels that were largely trying to embargo the country. And there were significant fears in Bath that we might have been invaded at the time. I believe there was even a scare about that at one point, but it turned out to be basically a miscommunication. Still, the War of 1812, an important part of Bath history. Another one of those things of feel free to take the tour yourself and read a bit more about it under this section. On South Street now, we finally get to the two Greek revivals. The two Crooker brothers both built lovely Greek revivals, one right in front of the other. I've sort of already talked about the Greek revival, so I'm not going to, just going to sort of skip over these, appreciate the lovely images. Here's the house that's in the back, and then here's the one that his brother built directly in front of him, a slightly grander, much more ostentatious version of Greek revival. Read into their relationship however you will, from building your big house right in front of your brother's house and making it just that little bit better. And then finally, we would turn off of South Street down to Middle Street, and there's this now little, it's a bit sad looking right now, there's a little red house that is where the Morse family, it was their family home. Originally, Wyman Morse lived in the house, and then he had his son, Benjamin Wyman Morse, who was in turn the father of Charles Wyman Morse, the same one who donates the money for the high school. And the family was mostly involved in shipping and the ice business. And it's Charles Wyman Morse who really takes off the ice business. Where he gets into all of his trouble is that he spent most of his time in New York because he held a veritable monopoly on the ice trade in New York in the early 20th century and late 19th century. And then as World War I breaks out, he gets involved in some shipbuilding schemes that don't go particularly well for him. War profiteering charges, flees to Europe, and only comes back to the United States on his deathbed. Fascinating history to read into. Really interesting character in general as far as that goes. And that is actually the end of the tour. I'm sorry to have sort of, sped through the end, but I spent way too much time talking earlier. And so I also won't bore you too terribly much with the details of how this all came about. I was just going to talk like how we do the research. Basically, it has great resources. There are maps, there are tax records, there are genealogical sources. Go look at them when you have the chance to again. We have so many great resources, and it's so much fun doing this kind of research. And so now I will call that the end of the presentation and open it up to questions that anyone might have.
That was fabulous. And by the way, now you all see now why it took a while for him to do this, because there is so much research involved, and that takes a lot of time, the digging and finding obscure mentions and all that sort of thing. I got to see him during some of this process and what he was going through, and the frustration of it. So I could sympathize.
I have a question,
Okay.
Jack.
Yes.
I was fascinated by all of your references to things in the history room that even after 2 years there, I know nothing whatsoever about, resources that we have. I wouldn't have any idea where to find them. Do you have links or information on the walking tour, or are you available to take me on a guided tour of the history room to tell me where I can find some of these resources? I'd love to see the old ladies' applications for the old ladies' home, things like that. I'd really.
Well, I'll take you on a guided tour anytime. But as far as organization goes, I think that's more something that Jill would be able to talk about. I know that we have now everything is
Okay.
lovely and cataloged. We have a great finding aid, which should make everything much easier to find now.
Maybe
Okay.
Jill loves the old ladies collection. Maybe she could speak to that a little. And she obviously, as Jack said, is definitely the best person right now too to talk about organization and stuff. Jill, do you want to talk about the old ladies collection in particular, or anything else?
I love that Jack brought up the old ladies' home. I think that collection is probably one of my favorites in the history room. And actually, just before we closed in March, I had been working on an exhibit about the old ladies' home. And so that was going to go up like probably the next week because it was Women's History Month. And unfortunately, we didn't get to see that, but I will revive it at some point. So the resources in the history room, I think you make a great point, Linda, that there's so much there. And you wouldn't necessarily know by looking, and you wouldn't necessarily know by looking at the online catalog. We have a lot of people in Bath, including the former managers and our volunteers, who know a ton about individual aspects of the history room. For instance, Linda, I know that you know everything about the vertical files.
Not everything.
And Jack knows a ton about what's been transcribed, and Karen knows a ton about our genealogical resources. And then I think Robin has everything in her head, and probably Peter too. So my priority for the history room is to get all of that, let's say, down on paper and available in the catalog, get some more finding aids. So the map is one great example. I think I mentioned that in the chat that the map that Jack was talking about, the Hammett map, was actually dated to around 1835, the last time that we talked about it. I got that from Nathan. Have to give credit where credit's due. This is the catalog record, which I'm pasting into the chat. So that's one thing that has been cataloged and which you can find online. More information about it. You can use subject headings in the catalog to kind of browse for items that are related to it by subject, browse for items that are also related to Abraham Hammett. For instance, there's a published book of his papers in the history room. He actually moved to Massachusetts, and a town in Massachusetts kind of claimed him. So they published a book of his papers. before the shutdown, my priority, like I was saying, was to catalog all of these things. And it's going to take a really long time, and it's going to take a lot of work from volunteers. That is, yeah.
I'll be glad to help out with that.
Oh, good.
It's on record now. This has been recorded, and now it's officially on record. You've said that.
I know, everybody knows.
Yeah. We're going to have to put your name on some finding aids.
It's already
Maybe
on
we'll
one.
the old ladies' home. But what's really funny is that, you know, I'm primarily a cataloger, but with the shutdown, like I was saying before, Karen and I, we just thought we have to show this stuff. We have to put it out there. And so that's become the priority for the next couple of months, to be honest, to bring people like Jack in, and to let Karen, oh, I am just tripping over my words, to let Karen share her genealogical knowledge. But eventually we'll get there. We'll get everything cataloged.
Well, another thought we have in mind is for a History Live program is actually, I don't know if we can do this, but we talked about maybe having Jill be in the room and maybe highlighting a few collections, just so that people can maybe see and hear about some a little more. And again, that might be a little distance off. It's just something that we've talked
That's a
about.
great idea.
Yeah.
I had a lot of fun showing off the postcards a couple weeks ago, and we have that really cool camera. So we'll do that again for sure. Did I answer your question, or did you want to hear more about the old ladies' home? Or should we?
I will, when we can get back into the history room, I'll ask you to show me where all of this is. And I you know, you can talk as much as you like now. I'm fascinated, but I think knowing what is where in the history room is a really sensational idea, because a lot of people come in. I've been there when a lot of people come in and ask questions that they sort of need somebody to show them where to find something, which could be, you know, it could be, if there were such a guide available, it would save the volunteers and you from having to sort of show people where to find certain resources, if there were a way to know where to go.
Although I think right now, too, there's a possibility, I don't know, of you maybe, Jill, having to reorganize a bit. So it would be hard, I think, right now to say, you're going to find the old lady's home on, is it the West Wall, I think, up on top. Currently, that's where it is. But
yeah, I'm not talking about anything that's going to be done in the next the next few months even, but it's a sort of an out there idea. I think it's a really sensational idea.
And I know at least a couple people are saying that, yes, they would love to hear more about the old ladies collection. So Jill, do you want to tell them about some of the records you were so excited about? She even loves the business records and stuff like that. It's great. I love seeing the enthusiasm. So Jill?
You know what? I would love to talk about the old ladies' home, but I'm actually going to save that for another presentation. Because it's worth a whole presentation for sure. Yeah. And I wonder if others have some more questions for Jack about the story map. I know that I have one. And also, while I'm still talking, I just want to say, Jack, that I think Levi P. Lemont would be like so thrilled to see this. Because I know that you did not find all of that information in his notes. I know that that information came from probably like what, a couple hundred different resources, would you say?
At least.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So you've really taken that work and just expanded on it in such an amazing way. So any other questions for Jack at the moment?
At one point you mentioned, go for it.
About Levi Lamont's notes.
Mm-hmm.
Did he leave notes about each of those places that you have on the map, on the tour?
Yes, everything that I have mentioned on the tour, other than I think with the exception of City Landing and buildings like the Custom House that come after 1879 when he compiles his notes were mentioned in his notes. Unfortunately, I didn't really get a chance to show this, but the way that he structures them is they are truly like these, he is walking down the streets of Bath and he goes, this person lives here and this person lives here, and on the other side of the street is this person, and on the corner is this person. And there's very little detailed information about them. So one of the resources I checked was his 1400 dates that often goes a bit more into some topics. And there are also some sections where he goes on and on about the like whole genealogy of a person who lived there and their descendants. But there are others where it's just very hard to tell where in Bath he is because he just mentions names and what side of the street they live on, and he's not always clear what street he's even on. So a big part of the transcription process was also like puzzling out what house is he talking about and where is he, and he actually goes all the way through North and West Bath too, which I didn't include. I limited this sort of walking towards a North to South Street so that people could in theory walk it. He covers an awful lot of ground, and it varies how much detail he gives to each person. So does that kind of answer your question? It's worth looking at his notes yourself at some point. I think I actually have them right now to keep working on the transcriptions, but no, so.
Yeah, I will definitely do that at some point. Does he do Commercial Street? Does he go down Commercial Street?
Oh gosh, does he? I'm pretty sure he gets very close to it. He certainly goes down some of the side streets. I'm trying to remember. I'll have to look. I'll go look and I'll send you an email to double check. But
Okay, don't worry about it.
No, I will. I think he might go on Commercial Street. I think. Oh, it's so hard. He talks about so many streets.
Hard to remember all the details. Now, at one point you mentioned a Richardson. Is that the same one that Robin has talked about? Who is the like of Richardsonian fame, or
no?
No, different one. Okay.
Richardsonian Romanesque was he was an architect, whereas R. Richardson was a doctor. I believe he was some sort of physician and at some point a mayor.
Yeah, sorry. You would think I'd know this by now.
But for those curious, the library's architectural style is Richardsonian Romanesque, is what Karen's talking about. There's a famous architect named Richardson who does Romanesque architecture, which is also sort of quasi-medieval, and it's known for its arches, like the lovely one over the double doors going into the reading room. So, but not the same Richardson who owns the Gothic Revival House in Bath. Although one of the architect Richardson's immediate students is who designs the library. So that's always a fun fact.
Any other questions?
Well, my question, Jack, is maybe you actually covered this, but can you tell us about some of the resources that you did use for your research? Maybe your favorites or
Least favorites?
least favorites?
Most frustrating moments?
Oh gosh, see, fortunately, I have worked in this so long, I've blocked out a lot of the frustrating moments at this point because those happened very early on. The hardest parts are like going through the tax records and when a name just doesn't show up. And you know, this person is supposed to own this house and it's supposed to be here and they're just not for some reason. And they'll show up in like the directories. Or gosh, I'm talking about all these resources. So let me actually take a step back and talk about my favorite resources that we used, which I love using the maps. I think they're oh so much fun. It's especially fun to use like the bird's eye map because this is, for those of you who don't know, the History Room has a lovely collection of maps, and one of them is a bird's eye that was probably done from like the reference of a hot air balloon at the time. So it gives an overview of the city in the 1870s, so right when the walking tour is being written. So most of the houses he talks about are probably shown. It's just very hard. It's not like they're labeled clearly, so it can be hard to figure out which is which. But if you can sort of figure out where this house was, if it was on a corner, then you can go look at the map with a magnifying glass and sort of get a rough idea of what the house probably looked like, which makes it easy to tell if it's still standing or not, which was one of the things I tried to do while working the tour was, you know, determine, is this structure still here or not? And I think some of a lot of the private residences might be. Obviously, if you looked at the map and knew that the red ones were demolished or no longer standing, many of them are no longer standing or have in some way been transformed and aren't quite the original building anymore. But a few of the private ones are so. The bird's eye, one of my favorite things, the maps in general. Holt is our wonderful genealogical resource. He compiled basically all of the prominent 19th century families in Bath into one convenient location. that makes it so much easier when you're looking at names, especially as Lemont just casually mentioned someone in an offhand way. And many of them will share last names because they'll be divergent branches of the same family. And so having Holt as a resource was so helpful, it can't not be amongst my favorites. And then it's very boring, but I'm partial to tax records. I just like going through and seeing what houses were evaluated at the time. I think there's something very exciting about that, and seeing like these grand Washington Street mansions that were, you know, a couple $100 in taxes a year, or that you could have bought in like the real estate records for $1,500. It's just, you know, funny to think about how inflation has affected us in that sense. And then I mentioned them, so I'll just talk about them. Directories. We have a wonderful little collection of directories that basically list where people lived in Bath. Unfortunately, street numbers don't get formalized for a very long time, but you can figure out who lived on a street and an awful lot of the businesses that were operating in Bath and who was running them and where they were living through our directories, which are fun. But again, the street numbers are infuriating. You can't, for a lot of the earlier ones, you cannot take the street number with anything more than a grain of salt. It does not line up with the current one. But that's also another great resource that was fun. And it helps to go through because some of the names remain the same, because Lemont goes along and he goes like, John Smith here, John Green there, the other John Smith, and he'll make some note about like the cousin of the other John Smith lived here. But if you can go through the directory and find like a Smith Green Smith, then you know that you're on the right street and the right section of streets, and the directories makes it much clearer that you are on Washington between North and Oak Streets. And then, of course, like the Old Ladies collection, I also always find fascinating, and Linda's wonderful work on the vertical files is helpful.
Yeah.
Shout out to all of my History Room volunteers and friends and the wonderful work that they do and all the various things that went into, I would actually call this much more of a collaborative process. Sure, I created the story map, but I could not have done it without Karen and Linda and Jill and Robin and everyone else who at some point has helped in this process, or contributed with work that they've done, made it much easier to find all these resources, or who helped me with the transcription as I went, what does this word say? And we puzzled out that it said ocean.